There are quiet shores along the coasts of Japan where the sea moves with a rhythm older than memory. In the early hours of morning, before the fishing boats leave their harbors and before the village lanterns fade completely into the rising light, the ocean breathes slowly against the sand. The waves arrive softly, carrying the scent of salt and distant currents from lands far beyond the horizon. In such places, the boundary between story and history becomes difficult to see. The elders of those villages sometimes say that the sea remembers everything. It remembers every boat that has crossed its surface, every storm that has darkened its waters, every life that has touched its tides. And sometimes, they say, the sea remembers people long after the world above has forgotten them. Among those quiet legends, one story has drifted through the centuries like a piece of old driftwood carried gently by the tide. It is the story of a fisherman, a man who once lived in a small coastal village beside a calm and generous sea, a man whose life was simple and steady, measured not by grand events or heroic deeds, but by the quiet patterns of the tide and the turning of the seasons. His name was Urashima Tarō. Even now, long after the village he knew has changed and the shoreline has shifted with the passing of countless storms, people still speak his name when the sea grows unusually calm. Because Urashima Tarō was not remembered for how he lived, he was remembered for what happened after he vanished. The story says that one evening, long ago, Urashima walked down to the shore as he had done many times before. The sky was painted with the fading colors of sunset, and the fishing boats had already begun to return from the deeper waters. Lanterns were being lit in the village behind him, their warm glow flickering gently through the narrow streets. Nothing about that evening seemed unusual. Nothing warned him that his life was about to change. Yet somewhere beneath the quiet waves, the sea had already begun to move with a different purpose. The tides that night carried more than salt and foam. They carried a story that had begun long before Urashima was born, because deep beneath the surface of the ocean, far beyond the reach of ordinary fishermen and their wooden boats, there existed a realm that few humans had ever seen and fewer still had ever returned from. It was a palace built of coral and pearl, where lanterns glowed like stars beneath the water and the currents carried music instead of wind. This was Iyugujo, the Dragon Palace. It was said to be the home of the great Sea Dragon King, the ancient ruler of the ocean depths whose domain stretched across every current and tide that touched the islands of Japan. Fishermen sometimes whispered about him when storms gathered along the horizon. They said the Dragon King could raise waves tall enough to swallow entire fleets, or calm the ocean so completely that the water shone like polished glass. But the Dragon Palace was not only a place of power, it was also a place of wonder. Within its halls lived the Princess of the Sea, a being as graceful as the tide itself. Her name was Adoheim, and the story said she could summon creatures of the ocean with nothing more than a gentle call. Fish with scales like silver lanterns swam through the palace gardens. Sea turtles, older than any living fisherman, drifted slowly through the coral gates, and the currents carried whispers from the deepest trenches of the ocean floor. For centuries, the Dragon Palace had remained hidden from the world above. The sea guarded its secrets carefully. But on that quiet evening, as Urashima Tarō walked along the shoreline with the sound of waves brushing against the sand, the distance between the human world and the world beneath the ocean began to grow thinner. Not through magic, not through destiny, but through something far simpler: kindness. Because the sea, like all ancient things, remembers acts that most people would consider small. A moment of compassion, a gentle hand, a choice made without expectation of reward. And on that evening, as the last light of the sun slipped below the horizon and the village lanterns flickered softly behind him, Urashima Tarō was about to make such a choice so simple that he would barely think of it afterward. Yet that single moment would carry him farther than any fisherman had ever traveled, far beyond the familiar coastline, far beyond the quiet waters where he had cast his net since childhood, and into a realm where time moved differently, where the sea itself held memories older than the mountains, where a fisherman from a small village would one day stand inside a palace beneath the ocean and realized that the world he had left behind might never be the same again. But on that quiet evening, Urashima Tarō did not yet know any of this. He only heard the sound of voices drifting from the beach ahead of him, children shouting, sand shifting beneath restless feet, and something else, a slow, scraping movement against the shore. The tide had brought something in, something alive, and though Urashima Tarō could not yet see it clearly in the fading light, that small moment on the shoreline was the first step in a journey that would carry his name into legend. A story carried by waves, a memory the sea would never forget. Light, and a faint mist often drifted across the water where the horizon met the quiet surface of the bay. Fishing boats rested gently along the shoreline, their wooden hulls rocking softly as the tide came and went. Urashima was usually among the first to arrive at the shore. He walked down the narrow path from the village with calm, familiar steps, carrying the same worn fishing basket he had used for many years. The path itself had been shaped by generations of fishermen before him. It curved between low stone walls and clusters of tall grass that rustled quietly whenever the sea wind moved through them. From the hill above the shore, the entire bay could be seen. The water stretched outward in long, shimmering layers, turning slowly from the pale silver of morning into the deeper blue that appeared once the sun climbed higher into the sky. Small fishing boats dotted the water like scattered leaves, and distant seabirds circled patiently above the waves. For most of the villagers, the sea was simply their livelihood, but for Urashima, it had always been something more. Since childhood, he had felt a quiet comfort in the sound of the waves and the endless horizon beyond them. While other fishermen spoke loudly as they prepared their nets, Urashima often worked in thoughtful silence, pausing sometimes to watch the slow movement of clouds reflected on the surface of the water. He was not a man known for many words, yet among the villagers he was known for something else: kindness. The elderly fishermen often said that Urashima possessed the sort of gentle heart that rarely appeared in a world where survival depended on strong hands and long hours at sea. If a neighbor's fishing net tore during a storm, Urashima would quietly repair it before dawn. If an older fisherman struggled to pull in his catch, Urashima would guide his boat alongside and help without expecting thanks. And when children gathered along the shore to watch the fishermen return each afternoon, Urashima was the one who always shared a few small fish with them, laughing softly as they ran home with their prizes. Because of this, the villagers trusted him. They trusted him with their boats, their nets, and sometimes even their worries when storms threatened the village. Urashima listened patiently when others spoke, nodding quietly as if the rhythm of the waves had taught him that every problem eventually passed, just like the tide. Most days followed a peaceful pattern. Urashima would push his small boat into the calm water shortly after sunrise, rowing slowly past the outer rocks, where the sea deepened into darker blue. The sound of his oars dipping into the water was soft and steady, and sometimes dolphins could be seen moving through the deeper channels farther out in the bay. When he reached his usual fishing place, he would lower his nets and sit quietly while the boat drifted with the current. Those were the moments Urashima liked best. The sea around him would become almost completely silent except for the distant cry of seabirds and the gentle creaking of the wooden boat beneath his feet. Sunlight would spread across the surface of the water like scattered gold, and small fish sometimes flashed beneath the waves before vanishing again into the deeper currents. During those quiet hours, Urashima often felt as though the sea itself was speaking, not with words, but with something older and deeper than language. The changing colors of the water, the slow breathing of the tide, the endless horizon where sky and ocean met without boundary. It was easy, in those moments, to forget the world beyond the shore. Yet Urashima never stayed at sea longer than he needed to. When the afternoon sun began to sink lower and the wind shifted toward evening, he would pull in his nets and begin rowing back toward the village. The shoreline would slowly grow larger before him, and soon the familiar wooden houses and narrow streets would appear between the green hills surrounding the bay. By then the village was always alive with sound, fishermen unloading their catch, children running along the beach, lanterns beginning to glow warmly inside the homes along the hillside. Urashima would tie his boat beside the others and carry his catch toward the small market square where villagers gathered before nightfall. Some fish he would sell, some he would trade, and a few he would quietly give away to neighbors who had caught little that day. Then, when the last light faded from the sea and the lanterns of the village reflected softly on the calm water, Urashima would walk home along the same narrow path he had taken that morning. His life was simple, quiet, predictable, and for many years nothing had ever disturbed that peaceful rhythm. Yet sometimes the sea changes without warning. A calm surface may hide deep currents moving far below, and though Urashima could not see it yet, the tide of his life was already beginning to turn, because on the following afternoon, as he returned from fishing and walked along the warm sand of the shoreline, he would hear something unusual carried by the wind. Children's voices, louder than usual, excited, restless, and mixed with those voices was another sound, a slow scraping movement across the sand. Something large had washed ashore, something alive. And before the sun set that evening, Urashima Tarō would make a small decision that would carry him far beyond the quiet village where he had lived his entire life. A decision so simple that at first it would seem almost unimportant. But the sea remembers such moments, and sometimes it chooses to answer them. The voices reached Urashima before the shoreline came fully into view. They echoed across the sand in bursts of excited shouting, carried easily by the open air of the beach. At first he assumed it was nothing unusual. Children often gathered along the shore during the late afternoon, chasing waves and racing along the water's edge while their parents finished their work in the village. But these voices sounded different. There was a restless edge to them, the kind that often followed mischief. Urashima slowed his steps as he approached the bend in the path that opened onto the wider stretch of beach. From there he could see the group of children gathered near the waterline, their small figures moving quickly in a loose circle. They were crowding around something. At first Urashima could not see what it was. The children's bodies blocked his view, and their excited movements stirred the sand into small drifting clouds that caught the golden light of the lowering sun. He stepped closer. The sound of the tide moved steadily beside them, waves rolling onto the sand and retreating again with a quiet whisper. Seabirds circled overhead, their distant cries echoing faintly across the water. Then the children shifted, and Urashima saw it, a turtle. It lay partly on its side near the edge of the surf, its dark shell half buried in the sand where the tide had pushed it ashore. The animal was larger than most turtles that wandered into the shallow waters of the bay. Its shell was old and weathered, marked with pale lines that suggested many years spent beneath the ocean currents. The children had surrounded it. Some were poking at the turtle with thin sticks they had gathered from the driftwood scattered along the beach. Others laughed as the turtle tried slowly to move, its flippers pushing awkwardly against the sand. One boy lifted a stick and tapped the shell again. The sound was hollow and dull, echoing slightly across the quiet shore. "Look how slow it is," one of them shouted. Another child kicked a small pile of sand toward the turtle, laughing as the grains scattered across its shell. The turtle did not fight. It simply tried to move forward, its flippers scraping slowly against the sand as it attempted to reach the water only a few steps away. But each time it moved, the children blocked its path again, circling around it with a careless curiosity that often belongs to youth. Urashima watched for a moment without speaking. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet concern. He stepped forward across the sand until his shadow stretched over the circle of children. "What are you doing?" he asked gently. The children turned, startled by the sudden voice behind them. When they saw Urashima standing there, several of them lowered their sticks and shuffled awkwardly in the sand. "It's just a turtle," one boy said defensively. "It washed up from the sea." Another added, "We're only playing." Urashima looked down at the turtle again. The creature's dark eyes blinked slowly in the fading sunlight. Its flippers moved weakly as it tried once more to push itself toward the surf, but the sand held it firmly in place. Urashima knelt beside it. The turtle's shell was cool beneath his hand, still damp from the ocean water that clung to its surface. Up close he could see that the pale markings on the shell were not simply patterns formed by age. They were scratches. Old ones, worn smooth by time, and newer ones still faintly sharp against the surface. The sea had carried this turtle through many journeys, perhaps farther than any fisherman could imagine. Urashima looked back at the children. "This turtle belongs in the ocean," he said quietly. The children hesitated. One of them kicked the sand again, though this time the movement seemed uncertain. But it came onto the beach, the boy said. "Then we should help it return," Urashima replied. The children exchanged glances. Their excitement had already begun to fade under the calm weight of Urashima's presence. None of them truly wished to argue with him. He was known throughout the village as someone who rarely spoke harshly, yet when he did speak, people listened. Slowly, one by one, the children stepped back. Urashima slipped his hands beneath the edges of the turtle's shell. The creature was heavier than it looked, but he lifted it carefully, supporting its weight with both arms. Sand slid away from the turtle's shell as he carried it toward the water. The waves moved quietly against the shore as Urashima stepped into the shallow surf. The cool water rushed around his feet. The tide pulled gently against his legs, as if urging the turtle forward. He lowered the animal into the water. For a moment it remained still. Then its flippers moved, slowly at first, pushing against the current as if testing the freedom of the sea once again. The turtle turned slightly, its dark eyes rising above the surface of the water. For a brief moment, it seemed to look directly at Urashima. The waves lifted it gently, and then it began to swim. The creature moved away from the shore with steady strokes, its shell disappearing gradually beneath the shifting surface of the ocean until only the faint ripple of water remained behind it. The children watched in silence. One of them laughed nervously. "Well," he said, "it's gone now." Urashima smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "back where it belongs." The sun had nearly touched the horizon by then. The sky above the sea had turned deep orange and gold, and the long reflection of light stretched across the water like a glowing path leading toward the distant horizon. Urashima stood quietly for a moment longer, watching the place where the turtle had disappeared. He felt no expectation of reward. To him, the act had been simple. A creature of the sea had been struggling, and he had helped it return home. Nothing more. Yet far beneath the surface of the water, beyond the reach of sunlight and the quiet waves that brushed against the shore, something had already begun to move. The ocean is deeper than most people realize, and sometimes the sea notices kindness. Sometimes it remembers. As Urashima turned and began walking back toward the village, the tide rolled gently across the sand behind him, erasing the footprints he had left along the shore. But somewhere beneath the darkening waters of the bay, a turtle swam steadily toward a place few humans had ever seen, toward a palace beneath the sea, and the currents carried with it a memory. The memory of the fisherman who had lifted it from the sand and returned it to the ocean without asking for anything in return. The sea would answer that kindness soon enough. But for now, the village lanterns were beginning to glow in the gathering twilight, and Urashima Tarō walked home believing the day had ended like any other. He did not yet know that the ocean had already begun preparing its reply. The following morning arrived with the same gentle quiet that always settled over the village before sunrise. A faint mist floated above the water, turning the surface of the bay into a soft silver mirror that reflected the pale light of the sky. The tide was calm, and only the distant cries of seabirds broke the stillness as they drifted lazily through the early morning air. Urashima Tarō walked down the familiar path toward the shore. The rhythm of his steps matched the quiet movements of the village around him. A few lanterns still glowed faintly inside the houses behind him, their warm light slowly fading as the sky brightened toward dawn. Somewhere farther up the hill, a rooster called out to greet the coming day. It was the same peaceful beginning that had marked countless mornings before. Urashima carried his fishing basket beneath one arm and a small coil of rope in the other hand. When he reached the edge of the beach, he paused for a moment as he always did, letting his eyes drift across the wide open water. The horizon stretched endlessly outward. Soft waves moved toward the sand in steady lines, their quiet motion blending with the cool breeze drifting in from the open sea. Fishing boats belonging to other villagers were already being pushed into the water, their wooden hulls creaking gently as fishermen prepared their nets. Urashima stepped into his own small boat and pushed away from the shore. The oars dipped smoothly into the water as he began rowing toward the deeper part of the bay where the currents were strongest and fish gathered beneath the surface. The mist thinned gradually as the sun climbed higher, and the pale light of morning slowly transformed the ocean into a field of shimmering blue. For several hours the day unfolded exactly as expected. Urashima lowered his nets and waited patiently while the sea drifted beneath his boat. Schools of small fish flashed beneath the surface from time to time, and once a pair of dolphins surfaced briefly before disappearing again into the deeper water. The calm of the sea settled easily around him. Eventually the sun began to lean toward the afternoon sky, and Urashima pulled his nets back into the boat. The catch was modest but sufficient, a few silver fish twisting quietly in the woven netting as he placed them carefully into his basket. Satisfied with the day's work, he turned his boat back toward the shore. The village slowly grew larger as he approached. Smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires, and the sandy beach stretched wide and empty beneath the afternoon light. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but as Urashima guided his boat closer to the shallows, something caught his eye. A dark shape moved slowly through the water just beyond the line where the waves broke against the sand. It rose briefly above the surface, then sank again. Urashima slowed his rowing. The shape appeared once more. This time it came closer. A rounded shell lifted gently from the water, glistening beneath the sunlight. Urashima blinked in surprise. The turtle. For a moment he simply watched as the creature drifted closer to his boat, moving slowly with the easy grace of something completely at home in the sea. Its dark shell glided through the clear water, and its flippers moved in calm, deliberate strokes. Urashima rested his oars against the sides of the boat. The turtle circled once. Then it stopped beside him. The creature's head rose above the surface of the water, and its dark eyes looked up toward him with a quiet stillness that felt strangely thoughtful. Urashima leaned slightly over the edge of the boat. "Well," he said softly, almost amused by the unexpected reunion, "it seems the sea brought you safely home." The turtle remained where it was. The water moved gently around its shell as the tide carried small ripples across the surface. For several long moments neither of them moved. Then something unusual happened. The turtle dipped its head slowly forward. The motion was small, yet unmistakable. It looked almost like a bow. Urashima frowned slightly, unsure whether his eyes had truly seen the movement correctly. "Turtles do not bow," he murmured quietly to himself. But the turtle lifted its head again and remained floating beside the boat, watching him patiently as if waiting for something. Urashima felt a faint ripple of curiosity stir within him. The sea was full of strange moments, but this one felt different. He set the fishing basket down and rested his arms along the edge of the boat, studying the creature more carefully. Up close, the turtle's shell seemed even older than he had noticed the day before. The pale markings that traced its surface looked almost like ancient patterns carved by the slow passage of time beneath the ocean currents. The turtle blinked slowly. Then, to Urashima's surprise, it began to move away from the boat. Not quickly, but with deliberate purpose. It swam several steps forward through the shallow water, then stopped and turned back. The turtle looked at him again. Urashima raised an eyebrow. "You want me to follow you?" he said lightly. The turtle drifted forward once more, then paused again. The same silent invitation hung in the quiet air between them. Urashima could not help but smile. "Well," he said with a quiet laugh, "I suppose there is no harm in seeing where you are going." He picked up the oars again and guided his small boat slowly behind the turtle as it moved through the shallow water. At first the turtle swam only a short distance along the shoreline. The sea remained calm, and the village houses were still visible behind Urashima when he glanced back toward the coast. But after a few moments the turtle turned. It began swimming toward the deeper water beyond the bay. The open ocean stretched wide ahead of them. Urashima hesitated for a moment. The deeper waters were not dangerous, but fishermen rarely traveled far beyond the familiar fishing grounds without reason. Still, the turtle continued moving forward. Its shell dipped beneath the water and rose again as it swam steadily outward, never once looking back to see whether Urashima was still following. Something about the moment felt strangely peaceful. The sea remained calm. The sky stretched wide and clear above them. Urashima allowed the boat to drift behind the turtle, rowing only occasionally to keep pace with its slow movement. Minutes passed. The village grew smaller behind him. Soon the familiar shoreline faded into a thin, pale line against the distant hills. Urashima watched the turtle glide through the water ahead of him. "Where are you taking me?" he asked quietly, though he knew no answer would come. The turtle continued swimming, farther, farther, until the water beneath the boat turned deep and dark, reflecting the endless blue sky above like a silent mirror. And then, without warning, the turtle stopped. It lifted its head above the water once more, and slowly, deliberately, it turned toward Urashima Tarō. The sea around them had become very quiet, so quiet that Urashima could hear only the faint creaking of his boat and the gentle breathing of the tide beneath the hull. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the turtle began to sink. Its shell slid gradually beneath the surface of the water, disappearing into the deep blue beneath the boat. Urashima leaned forward in surprise. "Wait." But before he could say anything more, the turtle rose again, this time directly beside the boat. And what happened next would change everything he believed about the sea. Because the turtle spoke. "Urashima Tarō," it said calmly, its voice as quiet and steady as the ocean itself. "Will you come with me to the Dragon Palace beneath the sea?" For a moment, Urashima Tarō believed the sound must have come from somewhere else. Perhaps from another boat drifting beyond the horizon. Perhaps from a fisherman calling across the water. But when he looked around, the ocean was empty. The wide surface of the sea stretched outward in every direction, broken only by the gentle movement of the tide beneath his boat. And beside the boat, floating calmly in the water, the turtle watched him. Its dark eyes were steady, patient. Urashima blinked slowly. He had spent most of his life beside the sea, and fishermen were known to speak of many strange things that appeared upon the water. Yet never once had he heard of a turtle speaking in a human voice. For a long moment he simply stared. Then he let out a quiet breath and gave a small, uncertain laugh. "Well," he murmured, rubbing the back of his neck, "either I have spent too many hours under the sun today, or the sea truly has more secrets than I thought." The turtle did not move. The water rippled softly around its shell as it floated beside the boat. Then it spoke again. "Urashima Tarō," the turtle said gently, "you saved my life yesterday on the shore." The calm voice seemed to drift through the air like the distant echo of waves. Urashima leaned slightly over the edge of the boat. "So it was you," he said softly. The turtle dipped its head once more, the motion slow and respectful. "I served the palace beneath the sea," it continued, "when the tide carried me onto the shore. I could not return to the water alone. Without your kindness, I would have perished beneath the sun." Urashima said nothing for a moment. The breeze moved quietly across the surface of the ocean, stirring faint ripples of light that shimmered around the boat. "I did only what anyone should have done," he finally replied. The turtle regarded him silently. "Not everyone would have done the same," it said. Urashima looked away toward the distant horizon. where the sky met the water in a pale line of light. "Well," he said with a quiet smile, "I suppose the sea brought us together again." The turtle's flippers moved slowly, keeping it steady beside the boat. "Yes," it replied. "And because of your kindness, the princess of the Dragon Palace wishes to thank you." Urashima felt a faint ripple of curiosity stir within him. "The Dragon Palace?" he asked. The turtle nodded. "Far beneath the ocean," it said, "there stands a palace built of coral and pearl. It is called Yugujo. There lives the great dragon king of the sea, and his daughter, the Princess Adoheim." Urashima had heard the name before. Fishermen sometimes whispered about the Dragon Palace during long nights, when storms gathered across the horizon. The stories spoke of glowing halls beneath the water and of sea creatures that moved like living lanterns through the dark currents. But those were only stories. At least, that was what most people believed. "You are telling me," Urashima said slowly, "that such a place truly exists?" The turtle's eyes gleamed softly. "It does," it said, "and the princess wishes to welcome you there." Urashima looked down at the quiet waters surrounding his boat. The sea was calm. The sunlight danced across its surface like scattered gold. For a moment he imagined what might lie beneath those endless blue depths. Then he laughed quietly again. "I am only a fisherman," he said. "What business would a man like me have in a palace beneath the sea?" The turtle answered without hesitation. "Kindness is always welcome there." The breeze shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of salt and distant tides. Urashima rested his arms along the edge of the boat and studied the turtle carefully. "You are asking me to visit this palace?" he said. "Yes." "And then return home afterward?" "If you wish." Urashima leaned back in his boat and gazed upward at the wide open sky. The clouds drifted slowly above him, moving with the same quiet patience as the sea below. His life had always followed the same gentle rhythm. Fishing, returning home, watching the tides rise and fall with the passing of days. There had never been anything mysterious about it, and yet the thought of seeing a world hidden beneath the ocean stirred something unexpected in his heart. A sense of wonder he had not felt since he was a child listening to fishermen's tales beneath the lantern light of the village. He lowered his gaze toward the turtle again. "If I say yes," he asked calmly, "how exactly would I reach this palace beneath the sea?" The turtle's answer was simple. "You will ride on my back." Urashima stared at the creature for a moment. Then he smiled. "Well," he said slowly, "that would certainly be a journey unlike any I have taken before." The turtle drifted closer to the boat. Its shell rose slightly above the surface of the water, broad and steady like a small island floating in the sea. "Climb down," the turtle said gently. Urashima hesitated only briefly. He secured his fishing basket and tied the rope of his boat carefully around one of the wooden supports along the side. The boat would drift safely with the tide until he returned. At least, he believed it would. Then he swung his legs over the edge of the boat and lowered himself into the cool water. The sea embraced him immediately, calm and welcoming. He grasped the edge of the turtle's shell and climbed carefully onto its back. The shell was smooth and solid beneath his hands, far stronger than he had expected. When he was seated comfortably, the turtle began to move. At first it swam slowly, carrying him away from the drifting boat. The water spread wide around them as they glided farther into the open sea. Urashima looked back once. His small fishing boat rocked gently upon the surface, growing smaller as the turtle carried him farther away. The turtle continued swimming. Farther, farther still. Soon the village shoreline had disappeared completely. Only the endless ocean remained. Then the turtle stopped. The water around them had become deep and dark, reflecting the sky like polished glass. Urashima felt the creature shift beneath him. "Hold tightly," the turtle said. Urashima grasped the edges of the shell. "What happens now?" he asked. The turtle's voice remained calm. "We go down." Before Urashima could respond, the turtle dipped beneath the surface of the sea. The water closed gently over them. For a brief instant, Urashima felt the cold rush of the ocean surrounding him. Then something extraordinary happened. The water around him grew warm. Soft light appeared beneath the surface, glowing faintly through the depths like distant lanterns. Urashima realized he could breathe. The sea no longer felt heavy around his body. Instead, it moved softly past him like a slow drifting wind. The turtle descended deeper. Above them, the surface of the ocean faded into pale blue light. Below them, the darkness of the deep sea slowly began to glow with strange colors. Schools of luminous fish drifted through the water like scattered stars. Coral forests rose from the ocean floor in twisting shapes of red and gold. Ancient sea creatures moved slowly through the currents, their forms vast and graceful in the dim light of the depths. Urashima's eyes widened in wonder. He had spent his entire life beside the sea, yet he had never imagined a world like this. The turtle continued its gentle descent. Far ahead, beyond the glowing coral and drifting fish, something enormous began to appear through the deep blue water. At first it looked like a mountain rising from the ocean floor, but as they drew closer, Urashima realized it was something else entirely. A palace. Its towers rose from the seabed like pillars of coral and pearl. Golden lanterns glowed beneath the water, lighting wide halls and sweeping gates carved from ancient stone. Colorful fish drifted through the palace gardens, and sea turtles larger than boats glided slowly along the outer walls. The turtle turned its head slightly. "Urashima Tarō," it said quietly, "the dragon palace awaits." And as the palace of Yugujo grew larger before him, Urashima realized that the quiet fisherman from a small village had just crossed the threshold into a world few humans had ever seen. A world hidden beneath the endless sea. The turtle carried Urashima Tarō slowly through the glowing waters of the deep sea. At first, Urashima could do little more than stare. The world beneath the ocean was unlike anything he had ever imagined. From the surface, the sea had always appeared simple and endless, a wide blue mirror reflecting the sky. But beneath those quiet waves there existed a realm of color, motion, and quiet life far beyond the understanding of fishermen who spent their days upon the water. Soft light drifted through the currents like scattered lanterns. Schools of small fish moved in long silver ribbons through the water, turning together in perfect harmony as they glided past the turtle. Their scales reflected the faint glow of the deep sea, flashing like tiny stars before fading again into the darker water beyond. Coral forests rose from the ocean floor in twisting towers of crimson, gold, and pale violet. Some stretched upward like ancient trees, their delicate branches swaying gently with the slow movement of the currents. Others formed broad arches beneath which great sea creatures drifted quietly through the dim water. Urashima felt the turtle descend slightly deeper. The water remained warm and calm around him, almost as though the sea itself had welcomed him into its hidden world. The strange magic that allowed him to breathe beneath the ocean continued to hold steady, and the currents moved past him like a soft wind instead of the crushing weight he might have expected. Far ahead, the palace grew clearer. Yugujo, the Dragon Palace. It rose from the seabed with a quiet majesty that made Urashima fall completely silent. The walls were not built of ordinary stone. Instead, they appeared to be formed from living coral that had grown into grand shapes over centuries, weaving together into towers and gates that shimmered faintly beneath the glowing water. Some of the palace towers curved like spiraling shells, their surfaces reflecting the soft light of lanterns hanging from delicate coral branches. Others rose in smooth white columns that resembled polished pearl, standing tall against the deep blue water surrounding them. Wide gates opened toward the ocean. They were guarded not by soldiers, but by enormous sea creatures that drifted calmly beside the entrance. Urashima saw great turtles larger than any boat he had ever sailed, their ancient shells once smoothed by centuries beneath the sea. Strange fish with long trailing fins moved slowly along the palace walls, their bodies glowing faintly with colors that shifted between pale blue and silver. Everything about the place felt peaceful, alive, as if the ocean itself had shaped the palace with patience and care. The turtle carrying Urashima glided through a wide archway formed from red coral. The entrance opened into a vast courtyard beneath the sea where soft sand covered the ground like a pale carpet. Lanterns hung from delicate branches of coral trees, their gentle glow spreading through the water like drifting moonlight. Urashima felt the turtle slow its movement. They passed beneath long bridges carved from smooth stone, where fish swam lazily through the open spaces between the pillars. Small gardens of coral spread upward along the palace paths, filled with colorful sea plants that moved gently whenever the current passed through them. In one garden he saw tiny glowing creatures floating in clusters like drifting fireflies. In another, large shell-shaped fountains released thin streams of bubbles that rose slowly toward the distant surface of the sea. The turtle finally stopped beside a wide staircase carved from pale stone. The steps rose upward toward a grand hall whose entrance was framed by tall pillars of coral that shimmered softly beneath the lantern light. Urashima carefully climbed down from the turtle's shell. The ocean floor felt surprisingly firm beneath his feet. For a moment he stood quietly, taking in the sight around him. Even the water itself seemed calmer within the palace grounds. The currents moved slowly here, guided by the coral walls so that the entire courtyard felt sheltered from the deeper movements of the ocean beyond. "It is beautiful," Urashima whispered. The turtle lifted its head beside him. "Yes," it said gently. "The Dragon Palace has stood here for many centuries." Urashima gazed upward toward the tall towers rising above the courtyard. "Do many humans come here?" he asked. The turtle shook its head slowly. "Very few." Urashima nodded thoughtfully. That did not surprise him. This place felt ancient and sacred, as though it belonged entirely to the ocean and the creatures who lived within it. A soft movement nearby drew his attention. Several graceful fish glided past him, their scales glowing faintly in the lantern light. They moved without fear, circling slowly around the courtyard before disappearing into the coral gardens again. It was then that Urashima noticed something else. Figures. They were approaching from the great hall above the staircase. At first he thought they were simply larger fish drifting through the water, but as they came closer he realized they were something entirely different. They moved upright, with long flowing robes that drifted gently around them like seaweed in the current. Their hair floated softly behind them, and their expressions were calm and welcoming. Servants of the palace. They bowed respectfully when they reached the base of the staircase. "The princess has been expecting you," one of them said. Urashima glanced toward the turtle in quiet amazement. "The princess?" he asked. The turtle nodded. "Yes," it replied. Then it turned slightly toward the great hall rising above them, the daughter of the Dragon King. Urashima followed the turtle's gaze. The tall doorway at the top of the staircase opened slowly. Soft golden light poured outward into the courtyard, brighter than any lantern he had seen so far beneath the sea. For a moment the entrance stood empty. Then a figure appeared. She stepped forward gracefully, her long robes flowing around her like drifting silk beneath the water. Her hair moved gently with the currents, and a faint glow surrounded her as though the light of the palace itself followed wherever she walked. Urashima felt an unexpected stillness settle over him. He had never seen anyone like her before. The turtle lowered its head respectfully. "Urashima Tarō," it said quietly. "Allow me to present Princess Otoheim of the Dragon Palace." And as the princess descended the staircase toward him, Urashima realized that the strange journey he had begun upon the surface of the sea was only just beginning. The true story of the Dragon Palace was about to unfold. Princess Otoheim descended the wide stone staircase with quiet grace. Each step she took stirred the water gently around her, causing the long sleeves of her flowing robes to drift softly like pale ribbons in the current. The lantern light of the palace shimmered across the delicate fabric, revealing faint patterns that resembled waves and clouds woven into the cloth. Urashima Tarō stood still at the base of the staircase, unsure whether he should bow or speak first. He had never met a princess before. In truth, He had never expected to meet anyone at all beneath the sea. Yet the calm dignity of the palace and the respectful silence of the servants surrounding them made it clear that he had entered a place of great importance. Princess Otoheim reached the final step and paused. Her expression was warm and welcoming, and when she looked at Urashima, her eyes reflected the soft glow of the palace lanterns like distant starlight beneath the water. "You must be Urashima Tarō," she said. Her voice was gentle, carrying easily through the quiet courtyard. Urashima bowed slightly. "Yes," he replied. "That is my name." The princess inclined her head in return. "Then allow me to welcome you," she said softly, "to Yugujo, the dragon palace of the sea." Urashima glanced around the vast courtyard once more. The coral towers, the drifting fish, the glowing gardens, everything around him still felt almost dreamlike. Even now it was difficult to believe that such a place truly existed beneath the quiet waves he had known all his life. "It is more beautiful than any story I have ever heard," he said honestly. The princess smiled. "The sea holds many wonders," she replied, "though few from the world above ever have the chance to see them." Urashima looked briefly toward the turtle resting beside him. "This creature told me you wished to thank me," he said. Princess Otohan nodded. "Yes." She turned her gaze toward the turtle. The great sea creature bowed deeply once more before slowly gliding away toward the coral gardens that surrounded the palace courtyard. "He is one of my most loyal attendants," the princess explained. "Yesterday the tide carried him onto the shore, far from the safety of the sea." Urashima remembered the moment clearly. The struggling turtle in the sand, the children with their sticks. "I only helped him return to the water," Urashima said modestly, "and because of that kindness," the princess replied, "he returned to us safely." She folded her hands gently before her. Acts of compassion are never forgotten in the Dragon Palace. Urashima felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I did only what seemed right," he said quietly. "That is often the greatest kind of kindness," the princess replied. For a moment the two of them stood in peaceful silence. Fish drifted slowly through the palace courtyard, their silver bodies catching the lantern light as they passed. Somewhere beyond the coral gardens, a long trail of glowing bubbles rose gently toward the distant surface of the sea. Princess Otoheim turned slightly toward the great hall behind her. "You have traveled far to reach this place," she said. "Please allow us to offer you our hospitality." Urashima hesitated. The palace was magnificent, and the calm beauty of the underwater world filled him with wonder. Yet part of him remained the same simple fisherman who had left the village that morning expecting nothing more unusual than an ordinary day at sea. "I would not wish to trouble the palace," he said. "You are no trouble," the princess replied kindly. She gestured lightly toward the grand doorway at the top of the staircase. "You are our guest." Urashima looked once more at the vast halls of coral and pearl rising behind her. Curiosity stirred again within him. "Very well," he said. The princess turned and began walking toward the staircase. Urashima followed. As they climbed the steps, the full scale of the palace began to reveal itself. The great hall at the top of the staircase stretched far beyond what he had first imagined. Tall pillars of polished coral rose toward the ceiling like the trunks of ancient trees, and glowing lanterns hung between them in gentle rows that illuminated the vast chamber. Servants moved quietly along the walls, their robes drifting gracefully in the calm currents of the hall. When Urashima entered the chamber, he could not help but pause in awe. The floor was covered with smooth white stone that reflected the soft golden light of the lanterns above. Long banners woven from shimmering sea silk hung between the pillars, their patterns shifting gently whenever the water moved. At the center of the hall stood a wide-open space where music seemed to drift faintly through the water. Soft instruments, unlike anything Urashima had ever heard, filled the air with slow, flowing melodies that echoed gently against the coral walls. "It is peaceful here," Urashima said quietly. Princess Otoha nodded. "The Dragon Palace has been a place of peace for many centuries," she replied. She led him deeper into the hall. Along the far wall, several large doorways opened into different chambers of the palace. Each doorway was framed by intricate carving shaped like waves and sea creatures. Urashima noticed that the light within each chamber was slightly different. Some glowed with warm golden tones, others shimmered with pale blue light. The princess noticed his curiosity. The palace is divided into halls that reflect the seasons of the world above, she explained. Urashima looked surprised. The seasons? He asked. Yes, she said. She gestured toward the first doorway. That chamber reflects spring. Through the open entrance, Urashima could see delicate sea flowers blooming along the walls, their colors bright and vibrant as though they had been touched by the warmth of sunlight. The princess gestured toward another doorway. And there, she continued, is summer. Warm golden light filled the chamber beyond, and schools of brightly colored fish drifted lazily through the open space like floating petals. Urashima stepped closer, fascinated by the sight. The princess continued, there are also halls for autumn and winter. Urashima could hardly imagine such wonders existing beneath the sea. You have built an entire world here, he said quietly. Princess Otoheim smiled gently. The ocean contains many worlds, she replied. Then she turned toward him once more. But tonight, Urashima Tarō, we wish only to celebrate your arrival. The music within the hall grew slightly brighter as several palace attendants approached, carrying delicate trays of food prepared from the treasures of the sea. Lantern light shimmered across the polished stone floor, and as Urashima Tarō stepped fully into the heart of the Dragon Palace, he began to feel as though the quiet life he had known upon the surface had drifted very far away. For the moment, the ocean had welcomed him into its hidden world, a world where time itself moved differently beneath the endless sea. The music within the great hall of the Dragon Palace drifted softly through the water, slow and gentle like the quiet movement of the tide. Urashima Tarō had never heard anything like it before. The instruments were unlike those used by musicians in the villages along the shore. Their sounds were smoother, flowing through the water as though each note had been shaped by the ocean itself. Some tones were deep and steady like the distant rumble of waves far out at sea. Others were light and delicate, rising and fading like bubbles drifting toward the surface. The melodies wrapped themselves around the great coral pillars of the hall and drifted upward toward the ceiling, where the lantern light shimmered softly against the pale stone above. Urashima followed Princess Otoheim as she led him through the center of the chamber. Servants moved gracefully around them, carrying trays filled with food prepared from the rich life of the ocean. Urashima noticed delicate bowls formed from polished shells and small dishes carved from pearl. Within them were foods he had never seen before. Translucent sea plants arranged like flowers, glistening slices of fish that shimmered faintly with color, and fruits grown from underwater gardens that glowed softly beneath the lantern light. Everything about the palace felt peaceful. There was no sense of hurry anywhere in the great hall. The servants moved with quiet patience, and the music continued its calm, flowing rhythm as though time itself drifted more slowly within the palace walls. Princess Otoheim guided Urashima toward one of the large doorways he had noticed earlier. This way, she said gently. They passed beneath an archway carved from pale coral and entered a chamber whose atmosphere felt immediately different from the hall behind them. Soft light filled the room. The walls were lined with delicate coral branches that resembled flowering trees, and small glowing fish moved among them like drifting petals. Sea plants of bright green and pale pink spread across the floor in graceful patterns, their leaves swaying slowly in the gentle currents that flowed through the chamber. Urashima stopped in quiet wonder. This place, he said softly. The Hall of Spring, Princess Otoheim explained. She stepped forward and gestured toward the living garden surrounding them. The palace contains chambers that reflect the seasons of the world above. Here we honor the renewal of life that comes each spring. Urashima knelt beside one of the coral plants, studying its delicate structure. The branches were covered with tiny blossoms that glowed faintly with a pale golden light. "They are beautiful," he said. "They bloom all year here," the princess replied. Urashima smiled faintly. "Then the ocean has discovered a way to keep spring forever." The princess regarded him with quiet curiosity. "You see the beauty of this place easily," she said. Urashima shrugged lightly. "When one spends many days watching the sea, one learns to notice small things." Princess Otoheim seemed pleased by the answer. Servants arrived quietly behind them, arranging cushions formed from soft sea silk along a low table carved from polished coral. The food that had been prepared in the great hall was placed carefully upon the table. Urashima hesitated. "I am not accustomed to such grand hospitality," he admitted. "You are our honored guest," the princess replied calmly. She gestured for him to sit. Urashima lowered himself onto one of the cushions. The material was surprisingly comfortable, supporting him easily as he settled beside the table. Princess Otoheim sat opposite him. The servants bowed respectfully and withdrew from the chamber, leaving the two of them alone within the glowing garden of the Hall of Spring. For a moment neither of them spoke. The soft music from the great hall drifted faintly through the doorway, blending with the gentle movement of the sea plants surrounding them. Urashima lifted one of the small shell bowls and studied the food inside. "What is this?" he asked. "A dish prepared from sea blossoms," the princess said. "They grow in the gardens outside the palace." Urashima tasted it carefully. The flavor was delicate and fresh, unlike anything he had eaten before. It reminded him faintly of the ocean breeze that sometimes drifted through the village during early morning. "It is very good," he said with surprise. Princess Otoheim smiled softly. "Many of the foods here are unknown to the world above." They continued eating slowly, speaking occasionally about the ocean and the village where Urashima lived. The fisherman found himself relaxing more easily than he had expected. Despite the grandeur of the palace, there was something deeply calming about the Dragon Palace. The quiet movement of the water and the endless beauty of the coral gardens created a sense of peace that seemed to settle naturally around him. At one point, Urashima glanced toward the doorway leading back to the great hall. "Does the Dragon King live here as well?" he asked. Princess Otoheim nodded. "My father rules the seas from the deeper chambers of the palace." Urashima looked thoughtful. "I hope my presence here does not cause trouble." The princess shook her head. "My father values acts of kindness greatly," she said. "He is pleased that you have come." Urashima lowered his gaze modestly. "I still feel that I have done very little to deserve such generosity." Princess Otoheim regarded him quietly for a moment. "In the world beneath the sea," she said gently, "kindness is never considered small." The soft glow of the coral blossoms brightened slightly as the current shifted through the chamber. Urashima leaned back slightly, allowing himself to enjoy the calm beauty of the hall around him. For the first time since arriving beneath the ocean, he began to feel completely at ease. The palace did not feel strange or distant anymore. It felt welcoming, peaceful, almost like a dream that one hopes will not end too soon. And as the music continued drifting through the water and the gentle light of the coral garden surrounded them, Urashima Tarō could not have known that the calm days he was about to spend within the Dragon Palace would pass in ways very different from the world he had left behind above the sea. For in the depths of the ocean, time itself often flows along currents unseen by human eyes. And what feels like only a few peaceful days beneath the sea may carry consequences that reach far beyond the quiet shores of home. After the quiet meal in the Hall of Spring, Princess Otoheim rose gracefully from her seat. Urashima Tarō followed her, brushing a few drifting petals of sea blossom from his sleeve as he stood. The soft currents that moved through the chamber carried the faint scent of ocean flowers, and the gentle music from the great hall continued to drift through the coral archway behind them. "Come," the princess said warmly. "There is more of the palace I would like to show you." Urashima nodded with quiet curiosity. He had already seen more wonder in a single hour beneath the sea than he had ever imagined possible. Yet the calm beauty of the Dragon Palace seemed endless, each new chamber revealing something different from the last. Princess Ottoheim led him back through the archway into the great hall. The lantern light shimmered gently across the polished coral floor, and the musicians seated near the far pillars continued their slow melodies. The music seemed to shift with the water itself, rising and falling like the distant breathing of the ocean. From the great hall, the princess guided him toward another of the large doorways he had noticed earlier. "This chamber reflects summer," she explained as they entered. Immediately the atmosphere changed. The water in this hall felt warmer, and the colors surrounding them grew richer and brighter. Coral structures rose from the floor in bold shapes of orange and deep crimson, while broad sea plants spread their leaves outward like underwater forests bathed in sunlight. Large schools of colorful fish swam lazily through the open space, their movements slow and graceful. Some had long, flowing fins that trailed behind them like ribbons in the current, while others shimmered with brilliant patterns that reminded Urashima of the tropical fishermen sometimes spotted in distant waters. Urashima turned slowly in place. "It feels like a warm summer day," he said quietly. Princess Ottoheim smiled. "That is the purpose of this hall." Urashima watched as a group of small golden fish drifted past him, their scales catching the lantern light like sparks. "It is remarkable," he added. "You have recreated the seasons themselves beneath the sea." The princess tilted her head slightly. "The ocean contains many forms of life," she said. "With patience and care, it is possible to shape those forms into places of harmony." Urashima followed her as she led him toward another doorway along the far side of the hall. "This one," she said softly, "is the Hall of Autumn." The change in atmosphere was immediate once they entered. The colors shifted to deep gold and amber. Coral branches here resembled trees with leaves that shimmered like falling autumn foliage. Soft currents moved through the chamber, carrying glowing particles that drifted slowly downward like underwater leaves. The light itself seemed softer here, more reflective. Urashima walked slowly along the coral path that wound through the hall. "This reminds me of the hills near my village," he said thoughtfully. "In autumn the trees turn gold, and the air grows cool and quiet." Princess Ottoheim listened with gentle interest. "The surface world must be very beautiful," she said. "It is," Urashima replied, "though perhaps not as wondrous as this palace." The princess did not answer immediately. Instead, she continued leading him deeper into the palace corridors until they reached the final chamber. The doorway opened into a vast hall filled with pale blue light. "This is the Hall of Winter," she said. Inside, the water felt cooler, and the coral structures had taken on shapes that resembled frozen branches. Pale sea crystals grew along the walls, reflecting the lantern light into delicate patterns across the floor. Slow drifting currents moved through the hall like a quiet winter wind. Urashima stepped carefully forward. The chamber felt peaceful in a different way from the others, quieter, almost solemn. "It is like standing in fresh snow," he murmured. Princess Ottoheim nodded. "The seasons of the world above remind us that time moves forward." Urashima glanced at her thoughtfully. "Does time move the same way here?" he asked. The princess looked toward the glowing coral ceiling above them. "The sea measures time differently," she replied softly. Urashima did not fully understand what she meant, yet the calm beauty of the palace made the question feel unimportant at that moment. He turned slowly, taking in the quiet elegance of the winter hall. When they finally returned to the great hall of the palace, the music had grown softer, and the lantern light had deepened into warm golden tones that filled the vast chamber with peaceful glow. Princess Ottoheim turned to him. "You must be tired from your journey," she said kindly. Urashima smiled faintly. "I am more amazed than tired." The princess laughed softly. "Even so, it would be good for you to rest." She gestured toward a long corridor that extended beyond the great hall. "A guest chamber has been prepared for you." Urashima followed her through the corridor, noticing how quiet the palace had become. The servants moved slowly and respectfully through the halls, and the distant music faded gradually behind them.
They reached a chamber whose walls were lined with delicate coral patterns that glowed softly beneath the lantern light.
"This will be your room," the princess said.
Urashima stepped inside.
The chamber was simple yet elegant, with a bed formed from soft sea silk and a small window of clear crystal that looked outward toward the dark blue depths beyond the palace walls. Through that window he could see glowing fish drifting slowly through the water like scattered stars. "It is beautiful," he said quietly.
Princess Otoheim bowed her head gently.
"Rest well, Urashima Tarō." With that, she turned and left him alone in the quiet chamber.
Urashima sat down beside the crystal window.
Outside, the endless ocean stretched outward in silent blue darkness, illuminated only by the drifting glow of sea creatures moving slowly through the depths.
He leaned back against the soft cushions of the bed and allowed the calm of the palace to settle around him.
It had been a strange and wondrous day, a morning spent fishing in the familiar waters of his village, and now a night resting inside a palace beneath the sea.
As the soft lantern light dimmed and the distant music faded completely, Urashima Tarō slowly closed his eyes.
The ocean currents moved gently beyond the palace walls, and somewhere within the quiet depths of the Dragon Palace, time continued to flow in ways he had not yet begun to understand.
Urashima Tarō woke to a quiet glow drifting through the crystal window beside his bed. For a moment he did not remember where he was. The light was different from the sunlight that usually entered the small house in his village.
It moved more slowly, shimmering gently as though it had been softened by layers of water far above. Then the memories of the previous day returned.
The turtle,
the descent beneath the sea, the great palace of coral and pearl. Urashima sat up slowly and looked out through the crystal window. Beyond the glass stretched the endless ocean, deep and calm.
Schools of luminous fish drifted silently through the blue water, their bodies glowing faintly as they moved past the palace walls. The sight was peaceful, almost dreamlike. For a moment he wondered whether the events of the previous day had truly happened, yet the quiet chamber around him felt very real. The coral walls shimmered softly with pale light, and the gentle movement of the sea outside created faint shifting patterns across the floor of the room.
Urashima rose from the bed and walked toward the window. Far below, he could see the coral gardens that surrounded the palace courtyard. Sea plants swayed slowly in the currents, and large turtles drifted gracefully along the outer walls of the palace. Everything seemed calm,
timeless. A soft knock echoed gently against the doorway behind him.
"Urashima Tarō," came the gentle voice of Princess Otoheim.
"Are you awake?"
Urashima turned quickly.
"Yes," he replied. "Please come in."
The door opened quietly.
Princess Otoheim entered the chamber, her flowing robes moving softly with the water around her, the faint glow that seemed to surround her reflected in a crystal window behind Urashima.
"I hope you rested well," she said.
"I did," Urashima answered honestly. He looked around the peaceful chamber once more.
"I cannot remember the last time I slept so calmly." The princess smiled. The ocean has a way of quieting restless thoughts.
Urashima nodded. "That seems to be true." She gestured toward the doorway.
"If you are ready, I would like to show you more of the palace gardens." Urashima followed her into the corridor beyond the chamber. The palace had grown brighter since the night before. Lanterns glowed warmly along the coral walls, and servants moved quietly through the halls carrying trays of food and baskets filled with sea blossoms. They passed once more through the great hall of the palace, where musicians were already playing slow melodies that echoed softly through the water. Beyond the hall, wide archways opened into the outer gardens. Urashima stepped through one of the coral gates and paused in wonder. The palace gardens stretched far beyond what he had expected. Fields of sea plants grew in carefully tended rows, their leaves glowing faintly beneath the filtered light of the ocean. Coral trees rose from the sandy ground like ancient forests, their branches twisting upward toward the distant surface. Strange creatures drifted peacefully among them, Large fish with bright, shimmering scales glided through the coral branches. Small, glowing jellyfish floated lazily in clusters like lanterns drifting through the night. Even the water itself felt different here.
Warmer, gentler.
Urashima walked slowly beside Princess Aroheim along the coral paths that wound through the gardens. "It is difficult to believe this place truly exists beneath the sea," he said quietly.
Princess Aroheim looked around at the drifting coral trees.
"This palace has stood here for many centuries," she replied. Urashima noticed something unusual. Although the gardens were full of life, there was no sense of hurry anywhere. The fish moved slowly through the water, and the palace attendants tended the coral plants with calm, deliberate care. Everything seemed to flow at a peaceful, unchanging pace. They walked for a long time.
At one point, Princess Aroheim showed him a garden filled entirely with glowing sea flowers that opened and closed slowly with the movement of the currents. In another garden, he saw enormous shells that produced soft streams of bubbles rising gently toward the distant surface.
Hours seemed to pass in quiet exploration.
Eventually, the princess led him back toward the palace. Servants were preparing another meal in the great hall, and the soft music continued to drift through the corridors. Urashima sat beside the princess at the low coral table once more. The food was as delicate and unfamiliar as the meal from the night before, and the peaceful rhythm of the palace made the time pass almost unnoticed.
Later they returned to the gardens,
then the halls of the palace,
and once again the quiet evening of the Dragon Palace settled around them.
Urashima slept again in the chamber beside the crystal window.
The next day passed much the same way.
Then another. Each morning he awoke to the soft glow of the ocean outside his window. Each day he walked through the coral gardens and spoke with Princess Aroheim about the sea and the distant world above. It was a peaceful life, gentle,
untroubled.
At times, Urashima almost forgot that he had once lived in a small village beside the shore.
The days beneath the sea flowed together so smoothly that it became difficult to measure how much time had truly passed. Had it been 3 days?
4? A week perhaps? Urashima was no longer certain.
Yet strangely, the thought did not trouble him. The Dragon Palace was a place of calm beauty, and the quiet kindness of Princess Aroheim made each day feel like a peaceful dream drifting through the currents of the sea. Still, far above them, beyond the vast waters that separated the palace from the surface world, the tides of time continued to move forward.
And though Urashima Tarō did not yet realize it, those tides were carrying his story slowly toward a moment that would change everything he believed about the life he had left behind.
For a long time, life in the Dragon Palace flowed as gently as the ocean currents surrounding it.
Urashima Tarō rose each day to the soft glow of the sea beyond his chamber window. The drifting fish, the quiet coral gardens, and the calm melodies echoing through the palace hall soon became as familiar to him as the waves along the shore of his village once had been.
At first, he believed he would remain only a short while, a few days perhaps.
Long enough to see the wonders of the palace and thank Princess Aroheim for her hospitality.
Yet those days passed easily.
Too easily.
Each morning seemed to follow the last without sharp edges to mark the passage of time. The palace moved in a rhythm that felt slower than the world above, as though the ocean itself softened the turning of days. Urashima often walked through the coral gardens with the princess. They spoke about the sea and the strange creatures that lived within it. Princess Aroheim showed him places deep within the palace grounds where ancient turtles drifted through quiet pools and glowing sea plants swayed slowly like underwater forests. Sometimes they visited the great halls again. The hall of spring remained filled with delicate blossoms that opened and closed gently with the shifting currents. In the hall of summer, brilliant fish drifted through warm golden light that never seemed to fade.
Urashima found himself growing fond of those chambers.
There was a peaceful beauty to them that made the days feel endless and calm. Yet slowly, almost without noticing, something else began to stir within his thoughts. It began with small memories, a faint image of the shoreline near his home,
the smell of wood smoke drifting from the houses of the village during evening,
the voices of fishermen calling to one another as they pulled their boats onto the sand.
At first these memories arrived like distant echoes. Urashima would pause for a moment in the coral gardens, feeling a strange sense of familiarity he could not immediately explain.
Then the memory would fade again beneath the quiet calm of the palace. But the memories returned,
a little stronger each time. One afternoon Urashima stood beside the crystal window of his chamber, watching a group of silver fish drift slowly through the water outside. The sight reminded him of the schools of fish he used to see beneath his boat when he lowered his nets into the sea. He realized suddenly that he had not held a fishing net in his hands for many days.
Perhaps many weeks.
He frowned slightly at the thought. When had he last thought about the village? He could not remember. Later that evening, while walking beside Princess Otoheim through the coral gardens, he paused beside one of the tall coral trees that swayed gently in the current. "Princess," he said quietly.
"Yes?"
she replied. Urashima hesitated for a moment before speaking again.
"May I ask you something?"
"Of course." He looked out across the gardens where glowing sea flowers drifted softly through the water.
"How long have I been here?"
Princess Otoheim did not answer immediately.
Instead, she looked toward the distant coral towers of the palace, her expression thoughtful. "In the Dragon Palace," she said gently, "time moves differently than it does in the world above." Urashima nodded slowly. I had begun to suspect that. He turned toward her again. "But surely it has not been very long."
The princess met his gaze.
"That depends on how one measures time."
Urashima smiled faintly, though there was a hint of unease in his voice now.
"I suppose fishermen measure time very simply."
"How so?"
"By the tides," he said, "and by the return of the sun each morning."
Princess Otoheim listened quietly.
Urashima looked back toward the open ocean beyond the palace gardens. "I have begun to wonder about the village," he admitted. "The people there must be wondering where I have gone." The princess remained silent.
Urashima continued.
"My parents are old now. I usually bring them fish each day from the sea."
He paused, and the fisherman who shared the harbor with me, his voice softened slightly.
"They may believe I was lost at sea." The coral leaves drifted slowly through the water round them.
Princess Otoheim spoke carefully.
"The world above continues to move forward," she said.
Urashima lowered his gaze. "I know."
For a long moment neither of them spoke. The quiet beauty of the palace remained unchanged around them, yet something within Urashima had begun to shift.
The peaceful dream of the Dragon Palace was no longer complete.
It now carried a faint thread of longing. Finally Urashima turned back toward the princess. "I've been treated with great kindness here," he said sincerely. "The palace has shown me wonders I will never forget."
Princess Otoheim bowed her head slightly.
"You are always welcome here." Urashima smiled gently.
"I am grateful for that." Then his voice became softer, but I think he paused.
"I think I must return to the surface." The words seemed to echo quietly through the coral garden.
Princess Otoheim did not look surprised.
Instead, she nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting this moment all along.
"I understand," she said. Urashima felt a small weight lift from his chest. "Thank you," he replied.
"I will return home and tell the people of my village about the kindness of the Dragon Palace." The princess looked toward the open sea beyond the palace walls. "You may return whenever you wish," she said gently.
Urashima bowed deeply.
"I will never forget what I have seen here." The quiet currents moved slowly through the coral trees around them, yet neither of them spoke for several moments, because both of them knew something Urashima had not yet fully realized.
Leaving the Dragon Palace would not be as simple as it seemed. The ocean had welcomed him into a world where time flowed along deeper currents than the tides he had known on the surface, and once a traveler had crossed those currents, returning home could change everything. Soon Urashima Tarō would discover just how much the world above had moved forward while he lived peacefully beneath the sea. The following morning, the palace seemed quieter than usual. The soft music that often drifted through the great halls had faded into distant echoes, and the lanterns along the coral corridors glowed with a dimmer, more thoughtful light. Urashima Tarō noticed the change as he walked through the palace beside Princess Adoheim.
Neither of them spoke for some time. The ocean outside the palace walls moved gently, carrying long ribbons of sunlight down from the distant surface far above. Fish drifted slowly through the currents, their movements calm and unhurried, as though the sea itself had no awareness of the quiet moment unfolding within the palace. Urashima finally broke the silence.
"I hope I have not caused any trouble by deciding to leave," he said. Princess Adoheim shook her head softly. "You have caused no trouble at all."
They continued walking through the coral corridors. "The Dragon Palace has welcomed travelers before," she continued, "and sometimes those travelers must return to the world they came from." Urashima nodded slowly. "I do not wish to leave so soon," he admitted, "but the thought of my village has grown stronger each day."
He paused for a moment.
"The sea is beautiful," he added, "but the shore is where my life began."
Princess Adoheim looked toward the distant light drifting through the palace windows.
"That is often the way of the human heart," she said quietly. They reached the great hall of the palace. The hall was empty now, its vast coral pillars rising into the high arches above.
The musicians who had once played there had already departed, leaving the chamber filled only with the quiet sound of water moving through the palace walls. At the center of the hall stood a small table made from polished shell.
Upon it rested a single object.
Urashima noticed it immediately. It was a small lacquer box, no larger than the size of both his hands placed together.
The surface of the box shone softly beneath the lantern light, decorated with delicate patterns of waves and drifting clouds painted in gold.
Princess Adoheim stepped toward the table.
"This is for you," she said.
Urashima approached slowly. "For me?" She nodded.
"It is called a tamit barco."
Urashima studied the box carefully. The craftsmanship was extraordinary.
The lacquer surface reflected the lantern light like still water, and the golden patterns seemed to move gently across the lid as though they were alive. "What is inside it?"
he asked. Princess Adoheim looked at the box for a long moment before answering.
"That is something you must not discover." Urashima frowned slightly. "I do not understand." She lifted the box from the table and placed it gently into his hands. "It is a gift from the Dragon Palace," she explained. "A memory of the time you spent beneath the sea." The box felt surprisingly light.
Urashima turned it carefully in his hands, studying the golden patterns along the edges.
"If it is a gift," he said slowly, "why must I never open it?"
Princess Adoheim met his gaze.
"Because some gifts are meant only to be carried, not to be uncovered."
Urashima considered her words.
"That sounds like a riddle."
"Perhaps it is." He looked down at the box again.
"There is truly nothing inside that I should see." The princess spoke gently. "What lies within the tamit barco belongs to the currents of time." Urashima lifted his head.
"The currents of time."
"The sea carries many things," she said. "Memories."
"Seasons."
"Moments that cannot be returned once they have passed." She placed her hand lightly over the lid of the box. "This box protects something precious." Urashima felt a strange weight settle into the quiet space between them.
"And if I open it?" he asked.
Princess Adoheim's voice became softer. "Then what has been protected will return to the world." The hall grew silent again.
Urashima did not fully understand her meaning, but he sensed that the warning carried a deep importance. He bowed respectfully.
"I promise I will not open it." Princess Adoheim smiled gently. "That promise will protect you." They stood together for a moment longer. Then the princess gestured toward the outer gates of the palace. "The turtle that brought you here is waiting beyond the coral gardens," she said.
Urashima felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. "So soon?"
"Yes."
He looked once more around the great hall, the coral pillars, the glowing lanterns, the vast chambers of the Dragon Palace. All of it had begun to feel strangely familiar during his time beneath the sea. Leaving it behind felt more difficult than he had expected.
yet the thought of the village above the waves still pulled gently at his heart.
He secured the tame barco carefully beneath his robe.
"I will treasure this gift," he said.
Princess Otoheim bowed.
"And I will remember the fisherman who showed kindness to a turtle beside the shore." They walked together through the palace corridors one final time. Beyond the coral gates, the turtle waited patiently in the outer garden. Its large shell gleamed softly beneath the drifting ocean light. Urashima placed his hand on the creature's shell once again.
"Are you ready?" Princess Otoheim asked. Urashima looked back toward the palace.
The coral towers rose behind her like silent mountains beneath the sea.
"Yes," he said quietly. "I am ready." He climbed onto the turtle shell.
The great creature began to move slowly through the water, gliding toward the open ocean beyond the palace walls.
Urashima looked back one last time. Princess Otoheim stood beside the coral gates, her robes drifting softly in the current as she watched him depart.
The dragon palace grew smaller in the distance. Soon the turtle was swimming upward through the deep blue waters toward the surface of the sea. Urashima held the tame barco carefully in his hands.
He did not know it yet, but the small lacquered box resting against his chest would soon reveal a truth that no traveler wishes to discover.
And when that moment came, the peaceful dream of the dragon palace would vanish like mist beneath the rising sun. The turtle carried Urashima Tarō slowly upward through the quiet depths of the sea.
At first the water around them remained deep and blue, the same endless ocean he had seen outside the windows of the dragon palace.
Schools of silver fish passed silently through the water, and long strands of drifting sea plants swayed gently in the currents.
Urashima held the tame barco carefully against his chest as the turtle swam. The box felt light in his hands, yet the warning Princess Otoheim had given him remained clear in his thoughts.
"Do not open it."
The words echoed quietly in his mind. He looked down at the golden patterns painted across the surface of the box. They seemed to shimmer softly as the sunlight filtering through the water grew brighter with each passing moment. The turtle continued its steady climb.
Slowly, the color of the ocean began to change. The deep blue darkness faded into a lighter shade, and thin ribbons of sunlight reached farther down into the water. Urashima could feel the warmth of the sun returning as they approached the surface.
He had not realized how much he had missed that warmth.
Above them, the water began to ripple with pale silver light. The surface of the sea was near. Urashima's heart began to beat a little faster. Soon he would see the shore again. Soon he would return to the small village where his life had always been. The turtle rose through the final layers of water. With a gentle movement, its head broke through the surface of the sea. The world above returned all at once. Bright sunlight filled the sky. The sound of waves rolled across the open water.
The wind brushed lightly across Urashima's face as he lifted his head and breathed in the fresh air of the surface world.
For a moment he simply sat there, letting the warmth of the sun and the sound of the ocean settle around him. The turtle turned slowly toward the distant shoreline. "There," Urashima whispered. Far ahead he could see the familiar line of land stretching along the horizon. The hills behind the village rose gently into the sky, and the long curve of the beach glowed softly beneath the afternoon sun.
Relief filled his chest. The village was still there. He had not been gone long.
The turtle swam steadily toward the shore. The waves rolled gently beneath them as they approached the sand. Soon the turtle's feet touched the shallow seabed beneath the water. Urashima slid carefully from the creature's shell and stepped into the cool surf. The water reached only to his knees now.
He turned back toward the turtle and bowed deeply.
"Thank you," he said.
"You carried me safely both to the dragon palace and back again." The turtle lowered its head slightly, as though returning the bow.
Then it turned and swam quietly back into the deeper water. Within moments it disappeared beneath the surface of the sea.
Urashima watched the place where it had vanished until the last ripples faded from the waves. Then he turned toward the shore. The sand felt warm beneath his feet as he walked up the beach.
The familiar scent of the ocean breeze filled the air.
Everything seemed exactly as he remembered.
Yet as he walked farther along the shoreline, something strange began to trouble him.
The beach was quiet, too quiet.
Usually fishermen would be mending their nets beside the boats or calling to one another across the sand. Children often ran along the shore chasing small crabs that darted between the rocks. But now there was no one there. Urashima frowned slightly. Perhaps the fishermen were still out at sea.
He continued walking toward the village.
The houses soon appeared beyond the line of trees that bordered the beach.
At first glance they seemed unchanged. Yet as Urashima approached the first building, he noticed something unfamiliar. The roof had been rebuilt. The wood was newer than he remembered. He walked farther along the path. Other houses stood where he expected them to be, but many of them had been repaired or rebuilt as well.
The small shrine at the center of the village looked different too. Its wooden gate had been replaced with a larger structure painted in bright red.
Urashima stopped in the middle of the path.
A strange unease began to grow inside him. Had the village changed this much during the short time he had been gone?
He continued walking.
A few villagers finally appeared along the road. They looked at him briefly as he passed, but none of them greeted him with recognition.
Urashima slowed his steps.
These were not the faces he remembered. He approached one of the villagers carefully. "Excuse me," he said. The man turned toward him.
"Yes?" Urashima hesitated for a moment.
"I am looking for the house of Urashima Tarō." The man's expression became puzzled.
"Urashima Tarō?" "Yes," Urashima replied.
"That is my name."
The villager studied him for a moment. "Urashima Tarō," he repeated slowly. Then he shook his head.
"I have heard that name before," he said. "But it belongs to a fisherman who lived here long ago." Urashima felt the ground beneath him seemed to shift slightly.
"Long ago?"
The villager nodded. "My grandfather used to tell stories about him." Urashima's voice grew quiet. "What kind of stories?"
The man shrugged. "They said he went out to sea one day and never returned." Urashima stared at him in silence.
"That was many years ago." The wind moved softly through the trees beside the road. Urashima lowered his gaze slowly. In his hands, the tammet barco felt heavier than before, and for the first time since leaving the Dragon Palace, a quiet fear began to grow in his heart,
because the world he had returned to no longer seemed to be the one he had left behind. Urashima Tarō stood motionless in the middle of the road.
The villager's words lingered in the air between them like a distant echo. A fisherman who lived here long ago.
For a moment Urashima believed he must have misunderstood. He forced a small smile.
"You must be mistaken," he said gently.
"I left the village only a short time ago." The villager studied him again, curiosity replacing the earlier confusion.
"A short time?"
he asked. Urashima nodded. "Yes."
"Only a few days." The man's expression shifted slightly, as though he were trying to decide whether the stranger before him was serious. "A few days,"
he repeated. He glanced toward the other houses along the road.
"My grandfather told stories about Urashima Tarō when I was a child."
Urashima felt a slow chill run through his chest.
The man continued speaking. "They said he disappeared at sea many generations ago." Urashima shook his head. "That cannot be."
His voice came out quieter than he expected. "I left this village after rescuing a turtle on the shore. The next morning I returned to the sea heap horsed, realizing suddenly how strange the story might sound to someone who had never seen the Dragon Palace. I was gone only a short while."
The villager remained silent for several seconds. Finally he said carefully, "The fisherman Urashima Tarō vanished long before my grandfather was born."
Urashima's breath slowed.
The road around him seemed strangely distant now.
"Long before," he repeated.
The villager nodded. "There is even an old stone marker near the shrine that mentions him." Urashima felt his hands tighten around the tammet barco.
He bowed slightly to the villager.
"Thank you," he said quietly. The man nodded politely and continued walking down the road. Urashima remained standing where he was. The breeze moved gently through the trees. In the distance he could hear the faint sound of waves striking the shore.
He turned slowly toward the center of the village.
The shrine stood where it always had,
but it was larger now.
The wooden torii gate at its entrance had been rebuilt, its bright red paint fresh and strong against the sky.
Urashima walked toward it. The path leading to the shrine was paved with smooth stones he did not remember. Even the old cedar tree that once stood beside the entrance had grown enormous, its trunk now wider than the width of a small house.
Urashima approached the shrine courtyard. At the far side of the courtyard stood a stone marker, weathered by time, covered in faint carvings.
His footsteps slowed as he approached it.
The writing on the stone had faded slightly, but he could still read the characters.
They spoke of a fisherman named Urashima Tarō,
a man who had once lived beside the sea, a man who had vanished upon the waters and never returned.
Urashima stared at the inscription for a long time. The world around him grew strangely quiet. If the story on the stone was true, then the fisherman described there was him.
Yet the village believed he had disappeared many generations ago.
Urashima stepped back slowly from the stone. His thoughts turned suddenly toward the Dragon Palace.
Princess Otoheim's words returned to him. In the Dragon Palace, time moves differently than it does in the world above.
At the time, he had not fully understood. Now the meaning began to settle into his heart like a heavy weight. He looked toward the sea beyond the village.
The waves rolled gently against the shore, exactly as they always had. But the village behind him had changed. The people were strangers. The houses were different. Even the old cedar tree had grown far older than he remembered. A quiet realization began to form. The days he had spent beneath the sea had not been days at all.
While he had walked through the coral gardens of the Dragon Palace, years had passed above the surface.
Perhaps even centuries.
Urashima's chest tightened. He walked slowly back toward the road.
The village continued its quiet life around him. Children ran past carrying baskets of fish. Fishermen repaired their nets beside the boats. None of them recognized him.
None of them knew his name. He had returned to the shore he once called home, yet the world he had known no longer existed.
The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and distant waves across the village. Urashima stood alone in the fading afternoon light. In his hands, the tame barco remained closed. Its golden pattern shimmered softly beneath the sun.
Princess Otoheim's final warning echoed again in his thoughts.
Do not open it. But now, surrounded by a world that had forgotten him, Urashima could not help wondering what secret the mysterious box was meant to protect,
and whether that secret might hold the only answer left to him.
The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. Golden light stretched across the sea, turning the surface of the water into a wide sheet of shimmering fire.
The fishermen of the village were beginning to pull their boats onto the sand, their voices carrying softly through the evening air. Urashima Tarō stood alone at the edge of the shore. He had returned to the place where his journey beneath the sea had begun.
The waves moved calmly across the sand, just as they always had. Yet nothing felt the same. The village behind him was alive with ordinary life.
Smoke rose from the rooftops of the houses as evening meals were prepared.
Lanterns began to glow along the narrow roads, and the quiet sounds of families settling into the night drifted gently through the air.
But none of it belonged to him anymore.
Urashima lowered himself slowly onto a smooth rock near the water's edge.
The Tammet barco rested in his hands. The lacquered box reflected the last light of the sun, its golden pattern shining softly in the fading daylight. He turned it slowly, studying its surface once more. Princess Otoheim's voice echoed in his memory. Do not open it. He had promised her that he would not.
At the time, the promise had felt simple.
Now it felt much heavier. Urashima stared out across the ocean.
Somewhere far beneath those waters stood the Dragon Palace, the coral gardens, the halls filled with music, the calm voice of Princess Otoheim.
For a moment he imagined returning there. He could almost see the palace gates rising once more from the deep blue sea, but he knew the turtle was gone.
The ocean's surface revealed no path back to that world. The waves moved steadily beneath the fading sky. Urashima's thoughts returned to the village. Everyone he had once known was gone.
His parents, the fishermen who had shared the harbor with him, the children who had run along the beach. Time had carried them all away while he had lived peacefully beneath the sea. He lowered his gaze again to the Tammet barco.
What lies within the Tame Barco belongs to the currents of time. Princess Adoheim's words returned to him clearly. Urashima's fingers traced the smooth edge of the box. The lid remained tightly sealed.
He had promised not to open it, but now the promise felt tangled with another question.
What if the box held something that could restore what had been lost?
What if it contained a way to return him to the time he once knew?
The thought rose quietly but stubbornly in his mind.
He looked out across the empty horizon.
The sun had nearly disappeared. The sky was deepening into evening. Urashima closed his eyes for a moment. I should keep my promise, he whispered to himself. But the silence of the shore gave no answer.
He opened his eyes again.
The Tame Barco rested quietly in his hands. The box seemed almost alive in the fading light, its golden patterns glowing faintly beneath the growing darkness.
Urashima stood slowly.
The waves continued their steady rhythm across the sand.
The village lanterns glowed warmly behind him, but he did not turn back toward them.
Instead, he walked a short distance along the beach until he stood where the tide reached his feet. The sea stretched endlessly before him.
He looked once more at the Tame Barco. His promise weighed heavily in his heart, yet the loneliness of the world around him pressed just as strongly.
If the box truly held something connected to time, perhaps opening it would bring understanding. Perhaps it would return him to the life he had lost. Or perhaps it would reveal the final truth of his strange journey. The wind moved gently across the water.
Urashima's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid of the box.
For a moment he hesitated.
The voice of Princess Adoheim echoed one final time.
"Do not open it."
But the quiet beach offered no other path forward.
Urashima Tarō slowly opened the Tame Barco. A thin white mist rose softly from the box. At first it drifted upward like a faint cloud, twisting gently in the evening air.
Urashima watched it in confusion.
Then the mist began to spread.
The white vapor wrapped around his hands, around his arms, around his shoulders.
The air grew colder.
The world around him seemed to shift.
Urashima tried to step backward, but his legs felt suddenly weak.
The mist thickened. It flowed upward around his face like smoke carried by the wind.
And within that drifting cloud, the truth that had been sealed inside the Tame Barco began to return to the world.
The currents of time had been waiting patiently within the box.
Now they were free, and they were finally catching up with the fisherman who had stepped beyond them. The mist continued to rise from the Tame Barco.
At first it moved gently, drifting into the evening air like a thin ribbon of white smoke carried by the breeze.
Urashima Tarō watched it with quiet confusion, the open box still resting in his hands.
He had expected something else.
Perhaps a hidden object, a message, some secret treasure from the Dragon Palace. But the box held only this strange mist.
For a moment he almost laughed at his own fear. Had he truly believed the small lacquered box could restore the world he had lost?
The white vapor curled slowly around his arms.
It felt cool against his skin.
The wind carried the mist upward, where it dissolved into the deepening twilight sky.
Urashima lowered the Tame Barco slightly. "Is that all?" he murmured softly. But the mist did not stop. More of it flowed from the box. The thin cloud thickened around him, drifting upward in quiet spirals that moved slowly through the fading light of evening.
Urashima felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest.
He placed the box carefully onto the sand beside him. The mist continued to rise. It moved across the beach like a pale veil, brushing softly against his robes as the wind carried it along the shore.
Then something began to change.
At first it was almost impossible to notice.
Urashima lifted his hand toward his face, intending to wipe the mist from his eyes.
But his hand trembled slightly as he raised it. He paused.
The trembling grew stronger.
His fingers felt stiff.
A strange weakness spread slowly through his arms.
Urashima frowned. What his voice came out rougher than before. The mist continued to drift around him.
The ocean waves moved quietly against the shore.
Yet something within his body had begun to shift.
He tried to take a step backward.
His legs felt heavy.
The strength that had always filled his body as a fisherman seemed to be slipping away. Urashima lifted his hand again and looked at it.
The skin on his fingers had begun to wrinkle. At first he thought the fading light was playing tricks on his eyes.
But the change continued. The smooth skin of his hands slowly grew thin and pale.
Fine lines appeared across his knuckles. His fingers trembled again.
A deep chill ran through him. The mist rose higher. It wrapped around his shoulders and drifted across his face. Urashima's breath became shallow.
His heart pounded as the truth began to settle slowly into his thoughts. The Tammet Barco, the box that protected the currents of time, Princess Adoheim had warned him. The mist swirling around him was not empty.
It carried something far greater than smoke or air. It carried the years he had escaped.
All the time that had passed while he lived beneath this sea. Urashima staggered slightly. His legs struggled to hold his weight.
The strength of youth faded quickly from his body. His hair, once dark like the waves of the ocean at night, began to pale.
Strands of silver appeared across his head as the wind moved through it.
Urashima reached for his hair in disbelief.
His fingers shook as they touched the white strands. "No," he whispered. The mist continued to rise.
It drifted upward into the darkening sky as though it had always been meant to return to the world above.
Each moment it remained around him carried another piece of the time he had left behind.
Urashima's back bent slightly as the weight of those years settled upon him.
The fisherman who had once carried heavy nets across the shore now struggled to stand upright.
The wind brushed softly across the beach. The waves rolled steadily against the sand. The village lanterns flickered in the distance.
Urashima's breathing slowed. His body had grown old, not gradually as the villagers of the world had aged,
but all at once.
The centuries he had escaped beneath the sea had finally returned. His knees weakened. He lowered himself slowly to the sand beside the open Tammet Barco.
The last strands of mist drifted upward into the night.
Urashima looked toward the ocean. The horizon had darkened.
Stars were beginning to appear across the sky. Somewhere far beneath the water lay the Dragon Palace, the coral halls, the quiet gardens.
The voice of Princess Adoheim. He understood now. The box had protected him. As long as the Tammet Barco remained closed, the time he had left behind could not reach him. But the moment he opened it, the years had returned.
Urashima's shoulders slumped gently.
His body felt light now, strangely peaceful. He looked down at the empty box resting beside him on the sand.
The golden pattern still shimmered faintly beneath the starlight.
He whispered softly into the quiet wind. "I understand now."
The ocean continued its endless rhythm along the shore.
And the fisherman who had once traveled beyond the boundaries of time sat quietly beneath the night sky, finally reunited with the years he had left behind.
The night deepened quietly over the shoreline. The waves continued their steady rhythm against the sand, rising and falling in the calm breath of the ocean. Above the water, the stars spread slowly across the sky, their pale light reflecting gently upon the dark surface of the sea. Urashima Tarō remained seated beside the open Tammet Barco. The strength that had once filled his body as a fisherman had faded with the rising mist. The years he had escaped beneath the sea had returned all at once, settling softly upon him like a long-waited tide.
His hands now rested lightly on his knees.
They were thin and lined with age.
For a long time he simply watched the ocean. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, the same horizon he had known since childhood, yet now it seemed both familiar and distant at the same time.
Somewhere far beneath those waters stood the Dragon Palace.
He could almost imagine it.
The coral towers rising through the deep blue sea, the quiet gardens of drifting sea blossoms, the soft voice of Princess Adoheim greeting him beneath the palace gates. A faint smile touched Urashima's face.
He remembered the calm days beneath the ocean,
the slow rhythm of the palace halls, the gentle kindness that had welcomed him into that hidden world. For a brief moment in his life, he had stepped beyond the ordinary path of time.
He had seen wonders few people would ever know.
Yet the world above the waves had continued to move forward, and the currents of time could not be escaped forever.
Urashima lowered his gaze to the tame barco resting beside him.
The small lacquered box lay open upon the sand. Its golden pattern still shimmered softly in the light of the stars. The mist that had once been sealed inside it had vanished completely.
The years it carried had already returned to their rightful place.
Urashima touched the edge of the box gently.
"I should have kept my promise," he murmured.
The wind moved softly across the beach,
but there was no anger in his voice.
only quiet understanding.
He had been given a gift,
a brief moment outside the flow of time, a glimpse of a world hidden beneath the ocean.
and though his choice had brought sorrow, the memory of that peaceful place still remained within his heart.
Urashima looked once more toward the sea. The tide had begun to rise again, the water creeping slowly across the sand as the night continued. He listened to the sound of the waves,
the same sound that had filled his childhood,
the same sound that had carried him out to sea so many times with his fishing nets and wooden boat.
Even now, after everything that had happened, the ocean felt familiar,
comforting, as though it had always been waiting quietly beside the shore.
Urashima closed his eyes for a moment. The cool night air brushed gently across his face.
The distant stars shimmered above him, and somewhere deep beneath, a water beyond the reach of human time, the Dragon Palace continued its silent existence.
Princess Otoheim might still walk through the coral gardens.
The palace lanterns might still glow softly within the ocean halls. Perhaps she even remembered the fisherman who had once visited her world.
Urashima opened his eyes again.
The night had grown deeper. The lanterns of the village flickered quietly in the distance. To those villagers, the story of Urashima Tarō was already an old legend carved into stone beside the shrine. A fisherman who had vanished at sea, a man who had stepped beyond the world and never returned.
But now the fisherman had returned after all.
Only not in the way anyone could have expected. Urashima placed the lid gently back onto the tame barco.
The box was empty now, its purpose complete. He rested his hands in his lap once more and looked toward the ocean one final time.
The waves continued their endless movement beneath the stars. The wind carried the quiet scent of salt across the shore.
And in that peaceful moment, the fisherman who had traveled beyond time allowed himself to rest.
The world had changed. The village had forgotten him.
But the ocean remained the same, calm,
endless, eternal. And so the story of Urashima Tarō drifted quietly into legend, carried by the waves and the wind across the shores of Japan. A reminder that time flows like the sea itself, and that even the most beautiful dreams must one day return to the shore. Long after the fisherman sat beside the shore, the ocean continued its quiet rhythm. The waves rose and fell beneath the moonlight, carrying the slow breath of the sea across the sand. The night air moved gently through the tall grasses near the beach, whispering softly through the reeds that lined the edge of the shore. Above the water, the stars shimmered like distant lanterns hung across the sky.
The village slept peacefully beyond the hill.
Lanterns glowed faintly in the narrow streets, and the sound of the ocean drifted quietly through the wooden houses as families rested through the night.
The fishermen's boats rocked gently where they had been tied along the docks, the ropes creaking softly with the movement of the tide. None of the villagers knew that an old legend had quietly returned to their shore.
For many generations they had told the story of Urashima Tarō, a fisherman who once lived among them,
a man who had sailed out upon the ocean and never returned.
The elders had passed the story to their children, and those children had carried it onward to the next generation. Some believed the fisherman had been lost at sea. Others believed the spirits of the ocean had taken him to a hidden world beneath the waves.
Over time, the truth of the story faded into mystery, yet the ocean remembered.
The sea holds many stories within its depths. It carries the echoes of forgotten journeys and the quiet footsteps of travelers who once walked along its shores. Every wave that rises upon the tide carries a fragment of those memories forward through time. Somewhere far beneath the surface of the water, beyond the reach of sunlight and storms, the Dragon Palace still stands, Its coral towers rise silently through the deep blue ocean. The palace halls remain filled with soft glowing lanterns, and the gardens of drifting sea blossoms continue to sway gently in the quiet currents. Princess Aroha may still walk those halls. The palace musicians may still play their slow melodies beneath the arches of coral and pearl, and perhaps, in the quiet corners of the palace, the memory of a fisherman from the surface world still lingers like a distant dream. For a brief moment in the endless flow of time, Urashima Tarō had crossed the boundary between worlds. He had seen the calm beauty hidden beneath the sea. He had stepped beyond the ordinary path of human life and touched a place where time itself moved differently. But even in that quiet palace beneath the ocean, the currents of time never truly stop. They move slowly, patiently, like the tide that rises and falls along every shore. The fisherman's journey reminds us of something simple and gentle, that time is a quiet companion walking beside every life. It moves through the seasons, through the turning of the tides, through the rising and setting of the sun. Sometimes we wish to escape it, sometimes we wish to hold a single moment forever, but time flows onward like the ocean itself, carrying every story forward into the future. And yet, within that endless movement, the memories of those moments remain. The calm gardens beneath the sea, the lantern-lit halls of the Dragon Palace, the quiet fisherman sitting beside the shore beneath the stars. These images drift softly through the world like the slow movement of waves across the sand, and when the night grows still and the ocean breeze moves gently through the air, it is easy to imagine that those stories are still whispering across the water. If you listen closely to the tide on a quiet evening, you may hear them. The waves brushing softly against the shore, the wind drifting through the reeds, the distant memory of a fisherman who once traveled beyond the sea and returned carrying the quiet truth of time. And as the night grows deeper and the world becomes calm and still, the ocean continues its endless song, a song older than any village, older than any legend, a song that moves with the slow breathing of the tides. So let the waves carry the story gently away. Let the ocean hold its memories beneath the stars, and as the quiet rhythm of the sea continues through the night, allow the mind to rest like a boat drifting softly upon the water, for the tides will continue their slow journey until morning, and somewhere beyond the horizon of sleep, the calm sea will still be waiting,